All right, for lecture 4, we'll be looking at perception influences. So as you see in this image, we've got an arrow that's kind of breaking through a wall, and I really like this quote. It says, "Every man takes the limits of his own field of vision for the limits of the world." So every man sees that this is not only their vision, their perceptual beliefs, but it is the beliefs of the entire world. Well, what can we do to get past that, to shoot through that barrier? As we learned last lecture, perception is a process that we engage in either consciously or subconsciously. But where do those perceptions come from? Why do we see things the way we do? What has influenced us to perceive the world the way that we do? And why do others experience wholly different views of the worlds? And these people can be across the world, across a nation, or just across the street. But many of us view things in such different ways. Now, there are a number of influences on perception. In this lecture, we're going to look at 3. We're going to look at cultural differences, psychological differences, physiological differences or influences, and then social roles. So let's look at the first influence on perception, and that is culture. As always, usually there's a clip or two in these lectures, so hopefully you've got the text version up by now and you know that you can toggle back and forth between them. So take a minute and watch this clip from Grey's Anatomy where the doctors experience cultural perceptions that sort of impact the way they are able to treat this patient. And you see this quite a bit in television shows that are linked to the healthcare industry, sometimes to television shows linked to education, or any really interactive and impactful, individually impactful career. So take a look at this when you get a chance. It's only about 6.5 minutes, and see what you think. Okay, so hopefully you've taken a minute to watch that video and think about how our cultural differences can impact even the health care that we receive, or in some cases even the education we receive, or just the attention we receive from other people. So we interpret others' communication in part by drawing on information from schemata, and we talked about that last lecture. We draw on that information. We collect that information from the schemata, or a mental model of aspects of the world or of the self that is kind of structured in a way as to facilitate the processes of cognition, so that's mental thinking, knowledge, and perception. That's a definition from dictionary.com. So go scoot back again. Let's repeat. A schemata is a mental model of the aspects of the world or of the self that is structured in a way as to facilitate or aid in the process of knowledge, learning, or cognition, and those perceptions. They are filled with beliefs, attitudes, values, and practices that you've learned in your own individual culture. When we form these perceptions based on cultural influences, we tend to kind of distinguish the us from the them by labeling in-groupers and out-groupers. So here's where we need to figure out what in-groupers and out-groupers are. They're going to sound just second nature. We do this all the time without even thinking. But it is important to know how we determine who is an in-grouper and who is an out-grouper and why. So who are those in-groupers? In-groupers are those that share our cultural beliefs. Now the key here is to remember that culture does not necessarily show in just regional differences. I can be from Illinois and someone else can be from Africa or Ghana in Africa, and that is obviously a cultural difference. However, I can also be from a family of a single mother, and my friend next door comes from a family of dual parents, a mom and a dad, while another friend down the street comes from a family of 2 mothers. So this cultural difference does not necessarily have to do with region. It could even be within your own family. So a sister and a brother in a family situation are going to experience cultural differences in perception because one is male and one is female. So there's culture everywhere. So when I say culture a lot in this lecture, keep in mind that this does not necessarily mean regional cultures, although that absolutely applies. So back to in-groupers. In-groupers are those that share our cultural beliefs, attitudes, and values, and are considered kind of fundamentally similar to us. And when we see these in-groupers, we're very likely to form positive impressions of these people, because think about it, we agree with them. They're like we are. So we have these positive impressions of people. And when people behave rudely, negatively, or things that we don't agree with, but they're part of our in-group, we're likely to attribute that behavior to external factors, kind of like those attribution errors that we talked about. So all those external factors seem to be the excuse that we provide for that rude or negative behavior. So we say, oh, well, you know, they were obviously treated poorly today, or it's really rainy outside, so they must be cranky. So that's the kind of thing that we usually attribute to bad behavior or negative behavior in groupers. Now, outgroupers are different. Outgroupers are people that are not fundamentally similar to us, so they literally are different from us. So their cultural beliefs, attitudes, and values are not necessarily opposite, but different from our own. And in this case, when they behave badly or rudely or negatively, and they're outgroupers, we're likely to attribute that behavior to more internal factors. So statistically speaking, and many studies have shown that when we see someone that is culturally different from us, whether that be regionally or male and female or different religions or different political beliefs, we tend to see that rude and negative behavior and immediately blame it on internal things. Well, they're just a jerk. Well, they just have a bad attitude. Wow, they're so rude. Instead of saying things like we did with the in-groupers. Oh man, they must have had a rough day. Okay? So in a second, if you get the chance, I want you to watch this very brief clip from the show Mean Girls. It very well illustrates how easily we tend to distinguish in-groupers and out-groupers. And we see this a lot when we look at television shows or movies that are linked to sort of a high school setting, because it's so predominant in cliques. But it happens even in the adult world, not just high school and not just preschool or kindergarten or what have you. It happens all the time. So take a minute and watch that 2-minute clip of Mean Girls and see how easy it was for them to distinguish between those that are in and those that are out. Alright, so you're back, and hopefully we are ready to move on to the next influence on perception. So this second influence is often confused because it looks, and I think I even made the mistake earlier on, just absent-mindedly saying psychological, when it is in reality physiological influences. And physiological, I always think the root word is physical. So it is the physical reaction, the physical influence. So in addition to our culture, our physical makeup can lead us to perceive the world and others in a very specific way. So for example, if you tend to get cold really easily, and you're in a room that's set at, say, 71 degrees, you might be thinking, wow, it's freezing in here. Well, at the same time, others that are not as easily chilled as you are may not have even noticed that the temperature was what it was, or maybe even might consider it a little bit warm. I mean, think about it. How many times have you ridden in the car with someone? I know this applies to my husband and I all the time. And one's freezing and one's burning up. It happens all the time. It's a physiological difference, and we experience and we perceive the world differently because of those physiological differences. So similar to this would be, for example, age. A person in their early teens will more than likely perceive the world differently than someone in their early 60s. It's a logical exception here. There are many factors that play into those physiological influences on perception. So here are a few. Our sight, hearing, touch, smell, all of those senses do play a part in it, and that's the example I gave with the fact that you might be feeling cold or hot. Age, as we mentioned earlier, your health. Things seem easier when you are in better health. The world looks different when you are not going to the doctor's office all the time. So health, fatigue, oh my goodness, as a college student, how can you not relate to this? Being exhausted really changes your perception of the world. Working through that exhaustion when you don't really have a choice to take a nap or to go to bed early, it really does change your perception of life. Hunger. When you're really hungry, it's very difficult to focus on things, and you tend to, when you do focus, you tend to focus on things that will satisfy or aggravate your hunger. Biological cycles, so your time periods in your life, children that are going through puberty, or just purely growing up, physically getting larger, taller, leg cramps when you're growing up, all those things will impact your perception. They influence where you see things in the world. Imagine how different you were as a 12-year-old, male or female, to the way you are now and projectedly into the future when you are 40 or 50. Next is your overall physiological challenges. So those are things like bipolar disorder, ADD and ADHD, any kind of psychological issues that you might have to deal with, obsessive compulsive. I know quite a few people that have that. And other physiological disorders that are actual mental connections that are either misfiring or just not working as efficiently as you would like them to. Now think about this. Imagine a hungry beggar walked up to a very well-dressed, plump woman shopping at the Rodeo Drive and said, "I haven't eaten anything for several days." And she replied, and almost as an envious prayer, "Oh God, I wish I had your willpower." It's a joke, it's kind of silly, but it absolutely does illustrate the differences in just our physiological makeup. So we've looked at culture and how culture can impact how we perceive the world. I would say that's one of the greatest places where we experience this impact in perception. But also our physiological influences can make a difference. They may not be permanent. They may not even be largely impactful, but they're there. Now, finally, let's look at the last influence on perception, and that is social roles. Our social roles, which are often defined by our society, that the society that we're currently in, and that can change, obviously. But these social roles are also great influences on our perception. In this case, our roles lead us to see the world and those that live in it in very certain ways. So think about this following situation and think about what you see here. You're going out to eat with a few of your friends to a brand new downtown restaurant. You are a chef at a different local restaurant. One of your friends is an interior designer and the other is a bartender at a nearby country club. During your night out, what do you think each will focus on when thinking back on what they liked or disliked about the restaurant? So you, who are the chef, will likely be thinking about the quality of the ingredients, the presentation of the food, how the flavors marry together, and so on. Your friend, who is the interior designer, will likely be thinking about how the restaurant was set up and decorated and organized and so on. While the third friend, the bartender, will be thinking about what drink selections were offered and how they were mixed and served. So all three of you go to the same place, but all three of you are perceiving that restaurant differently. I notice this a lot when my husband and I go out. We'll go to a restaurant. He's an electrician, or had been in the past, and we'll go to a restaurant and he will point out all these special light fixtures and how they did up lighting and how they did under cabinet lighting. And I wouldn't have even noticed that. But it's part of his job. I mean, think about this in some of the most common ways. You buy a car, and 30 seconds after you leave the parking lot with that car, you begin to see it everywhere. What we're influenced in, what we're immersed in, absolutely influences our perception. And that absolutely 100% applies to our social roles, where we are in society. Now, our social roles can be broken into a variety of categories, and these are just a couple. They can be expanded, obviously, and they are very limited in what I've provided here, but these are a good starting place. Your occupational roles are a big influence. As we mentioned before, if you go to that restaurant and you are a chef and your friend is an interior designer, you're going to see things differently. Imagine how your perceptions would change. You're a student right now, so imagine how your perceptions would change when you become a teacher someday, if that's the route you take. Or as an employee with a low-level employee, kind of entry level, imagine how your perception will change when you become management, or you are much higher up on the pay scale and on the occupational ranking, and so on. So occupational roles absolutely play a difference. Just really consider that when you think about when you go to a career and you begin to see those changes. Think about how the perception of how the company works or why people do the things that they do might change. So as an employee, you might think management is always out to get me. They are always focusing on the negative, and then you get into management and you go, I see why they were always focusing on the negative, and you tend to change your perception of that company or of that situation. Another one is gender roles, and we kind of touched on this a bit. As we said, culture does not necessarily mean someone in America and someone in China. That is absolutely a part of culture, but so do all these other things, all these social roles, and gender is one of those. So how do men and women perceive the world around them differently? Do they see things in drastically different ways? Absolutely. Next is socioeconomic roles, kind of like the example, the silly joke from above. There is quite a big difference between those that have a large amount of money and those that have very little. They see things differently. And the same for upper, middle, and lower classes. And I find it funny when you see those commercials or hear people joking about first world problems. That's an absolute beautifully structured illustration of socioeconomic roles and their impact on perception. And then finally, your relational roles. You know, as a spouse and a parent now myself, I absolutely understand this. Your relational roles are going to change your perspective. If any of you out there have children, you know that when you transition from being the child, you know, living at home with your parents, to into the role of the parent themselves, everything changes. You see the world very differently. So your relationship roles, once you're married, you have to see things differently, and so on, or in a very serious relationship. So each of these impacts how we see the world and those in it. Think about it. When you were a young teen, you might have felt that teens should be allotted numerous liberties that most parents did not allow. However, do you think your perception will change if and when you have a teen of your own? I would guarantee it. As a whole, perceptual influences mold and shape our experiences into what it is today. So combinations of culture, physical makeup, all those physiological influences, and social roles lead us to see our world and the people that occupy it in very individual ways. If those perceptions lead us to issues like ethnocentrism or stereotyping, we should check our perception and seek change. So follow these guidelines and make sure you are really seeing reality and you are not blocked by those walls of your culturally introduced perceptions. Make sure you are using your ability to find and improve your perceptions. Here are some things you can do. Check your punctuation. What that means is to check how information was organized. Where did you come up with this belief? Where did this perception of the world come from? Why did you put it in the order that you did? Why did point A come before point B? So those things may play a part in how you perceive a situation. If you are in a situation where you get upset, what triggered the being upset and why? So check that organization. Number 2, ask others to share their point of view with you regarding the sequence of events on how they are seeing things. So when you're thinking about how you organize things and what you checked first, what you saw first, because remember, we only pick apart certain things. But when you're doing that, ask others. Did you notice that? Did that bother you? Did you see what he or she just did? Sometimes they're going to go, what are you talking about? I do that sometimes. I'm very sensitive to certain things, and I pick up on like bad customer service, or I can be a bit of a feminist sometimes. So when people say things or act a certain way that is a little bit degrading, I notice it right away because I'm sensitive to it, where somebody else may not be. So check those punctuations. Next, check your knowledge. Never assume that you have the corner on the truth. Ask others to explain their meaning to you. Really, you have no idea how they got where they are. You may be getting formal training in communication, they may not have it. And you may be able to recognize some of those self-serving bias attitudes or other attribution errors, and to pick up on those, to know that you're being culturally influenced in those perceptions. But others may not have that ability because they're not trained in it. So keep that in mind. Check your knowledge. Make sure that you have the accurate knowledge. And if you are 100% confident you're good, then continue on. But if you're not, if you're worried that maybe you aren't 100% sure of what you're saying, then check with others. Next, check your attributions. Remember that all behavior is kind of a result of a multitude of things, a multitude of both internal and external forces. Make sure that you are focusing on what's accurate. Always check and see what's coming in. What internal attributions are being focused on your personality or what happened, and what external forces are playing a role. Next, check your perceptual influences. How does your culture, gender, or your personality kind of shape the perceptions of others? And then finally, check your impressions. Realize that your gestalts may bias your perception of subsequent information you learn about a person. If you have these beliefs, these ideas, these preconceived notions, they may influence your perception of a new person. So keep that in mind. And I would say more than anything, what I've learned individually, just personally, what I've learned more than anything is to get educated. And that doesn't necessarily mean a formal education, although obviously as a college professor I'm going to say, yeah, get educated. But it means getting educated in the best, easiest way you can come up with. Listen to podcasts, go to the library, all of those things. Get educated. All right, thank you guys, and we are done with perception for this lecture.